So we know that this is, it may be unconscious, but it's operating. How do you address that? Then you need something to say that in order to get rid of that bias there, that bias is not something the upper caste person is feeling. The bias is something the Dalit person or the OBC person is feeling. Of all kinds, especially for children, and especially science books and all, which were great. And so my parents actually learned Russian. So there were many Russians in Bhilai, so they would learn Russian and interact a lot with Russians. My approach, which is that if you think only as an individual and only in a very narrow framework, then you're getting it wrong somewhere. You're going to get your answers wrong because you're framing your questions too narrow.
Hey Kavita, I'm at the signal. Great. I'll see you in a minute.
Hi,
Hi
Amit.
Kavita, such a
Finally.
pleasure to finally meet you.
Yeah, after a 4-hour conversation where we spoke so much, but
Yeah.
we're actually meeting in person for the first time.
Yeah, and one gets a sense from these conversations that hey, you know the other person so well. So it's almost a surprise too.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you got here last night,
I got here last night, yeah.
saw the Delhi smog as you landed.
I saw the Delhi smog. The interesting thing is that yesterday Bombay, the AQI went to 360 at one point. So I was telling people that for once I'm relieved to be going to Delhi. I'll have some fresh air. Can you imagine? But that was a rare day in Bombay.
Yeah. The sea air, I think, does some of the sea washing or something. I always imagine.
And
that's
as
what
one
it
could
does.
dramatically say, there is a different kind of smog upon us these days. So, yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
So, Kavita, here's one question I have for you.
Yeah.
That given the events of the last few months, and it's been tough for both of us, it's been tough for everybody. Sometimes I wonder if I should just follow Kashinath Singh's advice in Kashi Ka Assi, which is Bhar mein jaye duniya, hum bajaye harmonia. To translate that, that means let the world go to hell, I will play my harmonium. And it's actually, in a sense, easy for me to do that in Bombay because I'm not in the thick of all the politics and everything that's happening. But one of the reasons I admire you is that you haven't done that. If you have continued throwing yourself into the thick of things, no matter how unpleasant, no matter how seemingly hopeless. So I just want to ask, how do you do that? Like, how do you manage to keep yourself so involved?
Well, I do a little bit of both, okay, because I also take time to just try and appreciate whatever small things there are, like flowering trees and birds and so on, so that one can not always be in the heat of things. Yeah, but as you know, I mean, even that it's difficult to do anything now without having the world impinge on you, because who knows how long the trees around us will remain the way they are now and all of that, because Delhi's landscape is being changed by the King Emperor. So
The King Emperor, indeed. Another thing that kind of has always struck me about our country in so many different contexts is that how there are so many contradictory aspects colliding. And for example, one way in which this is true is that while on the one hand I often feel that the people have become apathetic, that they've given up on good governance and therefore they're not affected by bad governance. They've just whether it's inertia or apathy, they simply don't seem to care. But on the other hand, one of the things that has gave me a lot of hope in recent years was to see the CAA protest last year before COVID struck, where thousands of youngsters on the streets waving copies of the preamble, bursting with idealism and passion. How does one kind of reconcile that? Was that a fleeting moment, or is there some hope that one can take away?
I just never actually totally buy into the idea that people are apathetic, because I think they said that even in the 90s when we were students. They said it about students then, and it wasn't true then. And today is 15 December, so it's 2 years since Jamia was attacked by the Delhi police. And I remember how footage of those attacks actually made a lot of ordinary middle class Hindus open their eyes to what the CAA meant. And I think to some extent it backfired on the regime, because it actually ended up forcing a lot of people to recognize what was happening. And I don't think CAA movement was then, but then you've had the farmers movement, and you've had them actually achieve a victory in the face of all odds. And you had people from middle class and students and so on also getting involved with the farmers. So I think that it's not exactly apathy. With COVID, for instance, I've seen how the rural poor have been affected so badly, and yet people are saying, where's the anger that you're seeing in other countries? You're seeing it in the Philippines, you're seeing it in Brazil, but you're not seeing it in India about the government's handling of COVID. But I think that the bar for public health, for instance, has been set so low, and people are used to suffering so much. It's often mistakenly called resilience and all of that. I hate that language, but I think that people find a way to survive these things, and their expectations from the government get lower also, because the narrative that's built up in the media and so on is that these are not things that you should be voicing. So for some time I think these things sort of simmer and don't really find expression. But then, as you said, I mean, they burst out, and in things that appear fleeting, but I don't think it's all that fleeting. I think it is there around us.
I think there's a problem that is deeper and bigger than that. Like when COVID struck in April, I wrote this column about how we are confronted with two disasters, and one, of course, is a pandemic, but the other is a disaster of the dysfunctional state, which has been oppressive and dysfunctional for more than 70 years,
Yes.
and we've taken it for granted. For example, you have 3,000 children dying every day of starvation in this country. 1 in 4 Indian children below a certain age, I forget the age, is malnourished.
Yes.
And there are so many things wrong with our country that if they were caused by a natural disaster, the world would be rushing to our aid. And yet, we are blind to it. It is unseen to us. We take it for granted. We've normalized it. And that has nothing to do with this regime or the previous regime or
Yes,
whatever.
yes, yes.
It's just the way that the state is, and it's so depressing. And I think that's what I meant when I spoke about the apathy, that if a building falls down today, we'll all say, oh my god, kuch karna chahiye. But the fact that so many people are homeless and have been for decades, that doesn't move us.
Well, that's true, and I'm not sure if it's a dysfunctional state or that is the functioning state. That's my perspective. I am a Marxist, and the way I see this is that there is a sort of structural inequality, and making sure things don't get out of control and there isn't, anger doesn't spill over beyond a point. That's part of the job of the state. But also making sure, these are not, that politics revolves around concerns other than something like housing or health or education. And the fact is that, you see, the pandemic became the pandemic because it started affecting people who aren't usually affected by it. So it affected classes of people who thought that they could buy healthcare. Whereas in the normal, disasters that you talk about, it's mainly the poor that are the worst affected. look around us, I mean, this is what I was talking about, that, this was a particularly pleasant part of Delhi. At least I saw it as a beautiful part of the city. But now it's all dug up and it's going to become unrecognizable because Maharaja Modi wants his regime remembered by a complete change of this area.
Yeah, Maharaja Modi is actually very apt because Indians somehow we don't think of ourselves as citizens. We think of ourselves as subjects, and we have rulers, and so that phrase is applicable, and also it alliterates, which is delightful, Maharaja Modi. But even apart from that, it I think applied to all our rulers. The way in which after independence we took over the colonial state apparatus, which continues to be perhaps in many ways more oppressive than the British were. But what I'm interested in is also earlier you mentioned about how when that thing happened at Jamia, that even middle class Hindus kind of woke up and realized something was happening. Now there are two ways of looking at what has happened in our society over the last few years. One is to say that there was always a sort of divisive tribal thinking that was lurking within society that has found full expression, but these strains have been with us for decades. Look at how women are treated, look at how Dalits are treated. But the other strain, which Jayaprakash Narayan pointed out to me in an episode he did with me, that India is also deeply liberal in the way that we assimilate everything. And as our food reflects, our languages reflect all of that. Now, you are someone who's traveled so much, and I could spend hours and hours asking you about that. You're someone who's actually traveled so much in the hinterlands, met people, met ordinary people from all religions. What is your sense? Was this deep-rooted through the decades, always simply waiting to express itself, or has it become markedly worse in recent times?
See, I think there have always been fault lines, and in a sense, that goes back to colonial rule and the whole divide and rule kind of policies, and even the divorce between a language like Hindi and a language like Urdu, which are in a sense one language, but there's a division now. So it does go back a long way, and I would often point out that if you scratch the surface, then prejudices are there. And even among, for instance, in the way in which Indian villages are organized, so you have Dalits living outside the village in a separate hamlet, and very often poor Muslims, very often from oppressed castes among Muslims, are living next door. So there would be a whole lot of interaction and shared, festivals and shared eating. So, in people, and even shared movements, okay? And, well, if you ask them, if you ask Dalit communities there what they think about Muslims, you find them sort of a little safer from, or, inoculated against the larger prejudices, the usual prejudices about Muslims. And yet, if you ask them, okay, what about if your daughter, somebody's daughter fell in love with a Muslim and married him, they'll say that was a bad thing. So I think especially where patriarchy is concerned, especially where larger narratives like nationalism and how that's defined come in, there were always illiberal kind of tendencies and prejudices. But what I think is the problem now is that there's such a large apparatus, so the media, social media, and the state and the ruling party and everybody, so many outfits in society calling out to the illiberal and shutting up the liberal bits inside the same person. So, you can have, I know, in our loved ones we see this all the time, where you may have an illiberal expression of ideas, but when you're actually confronted with meeting a person, you are actually a different person there. You're not somebody who's acting out on those awful ideas you have. And today what is happening is that I think that is changing, because you're being encouraged to actually be the worst version of yourself. And the movements in India, like the Dalit movement, the feminist movement, trade union movement, very often they even earlier used to be called, these are westernized ideas, and especially feminism. But I think that the way I would see those movements is that they were trying to call out to the people to be the best version of themselves, you know. But it's much harder for them to do that now because you have to be heard above this din. And the din is so much because there's so much homogeneity in big media. And I think it's difficult to it's difficult for people outside India to understand how much the big media shapes narrative and Indian social expression, you know, because there is less of literacy, less, your social commons have now become, so affected by big media and social media.
I love the phrase you used, the best version of themselves. Like, one of the themes that I keep harping upon is that we all contain multitudes, right? And somebody who might have some kind of, say, anti-Muslim sentiment might also have other desires that can be appealed to. Like, they might want a better future for themselves or their children. They might want to see a more prosperous India. But what I see in Indian politics, distressingly, is that we keep appealing to, the worst versions of themselves. Like, every party seems to be pandering at some level towards this Hindutva vote, and making outward shows of religiosity. Like, there is this old story about how Lal Bahadur Shastri was once asked about his religion, and of course everyone knows he was a devout Hindu, but he was a prime minister at the time, and he said that as a prime minister, I cannot talk about religion, I cannot make a show of my religiosity. But that is completely absent today. So does this lack of imagination in our politics bother you? Because you are, of course, from one of those parties which is sticking with its principles and not going down that route, whether one agrees with those principles or not. You're sticking to that. There is integrity there. But no, the rest of the discourse is so polluted.
No, I think it's also a sort of giving up, in a sense, by so many of the parties. Even take the BSP, okay, or take Samajwadi Party, all the parties of the Samajwadi tradition, the socialist tradition, not socialist in a communist left sense, but in the sense of social justice, caste justice, so equality. Those parties once held, at least in principle, a different position. And yet now they are so shy of speaking about equal citizenship of Muslims, and I think that is a very sad thing, because you're underestimating Indian people there. I think that is why when I talk about how my party deals with these things, I think it's a huge mistake. If you've already conceded that the Hindu person in India is going to respond like a Hindu supremacist, then you've given up. You are not contesting that reality, and then you're hoping that you can somehow get them to vote differently by thinking as farmers or as workers or whatever it is. But it's not going to happen that way unless you also embolden people among the Hindu sections most vulnerable to Hindu supremacist politics, until you embolden people among them to say it's okay to say I'm not there. Otherwise, you're going to send out the message that on that count we all have to say yes. You have to conform when it comes to Hindutva. But one thing which I wanted to ask you, which you mentioned earlier, you spoke about these structural disparities and injustices and all of that. You said. But I think that you and I probably would differ very much when it comes to how to resolve those. What are the measures we should have to address those inequalities? So, how would you look at something like poverty and hunger, malnutrition, as you said, health, public health, things like that? What's your vision of
My
India
sense
in
has
the world?
always been that our greatest strength is voluntary action within civil society, and markets, when they are free markets, are a mechanism of that. Like what we saw during the pandemic also is that the state failed us in every way, but civil society stood up for itself in different ways to help out. Like I did an episode with a friend called Ruben Mascarenas who led this movement in Bombay to feed the people who, the migrant workers who couldn't get food. So many people, both in Delhi and Mumbai and all, took so many initiatives which was civil society working. Now, markets can also work in another way when they are cronyist markets, as we often see around us here, where the state uses a suppressive tool to favor certain cronies and it doesn't work for everyone. Like when we talk about markets, I often point out that we have to make the distinction between pro-market policies and pro-business policies are actually exactly the opposite, because a pro-market policy will expand everyone's choice and will benefit everyone. It's really civil society coming together through voluntary action to make everyone better off. Like in a free market, every voluntary exchange leaves both people better off. When you and I talk, it's a positive sum game. We are both benefiting from the conversation. When I buy a cup of coffee, I value the coffee more than the money I paid for it, and the cafe values money more than it's what John Stossel called the double thank you moment. And I think societies progress through such double thank you moment. And my fundamental principle, the principle behind everything I believe in, and I don't want to attach a label to myself, but you can boil it down to this, is a principle I know you agree with, and that is a principle of consent. That when people interact through mutual consent in ways that harm no one else, they are both benefiting, and therefore society is better off as a result. And this is whether it is in the bedroom or the marketplace. And different ideologies will come down on different aspects of those kind of voluntary interactions. And the truth about India is that our state is an incredibly coercive state. The few things that it should do in terms of protecting our rights, it doesn't do. That is the main justification of the state. The many other things it tries to do, it does badly, and it stops a private enterprise from stepping in to help out. And a classic example of that during COVID, for example, would be vaccines. That right from when the vaccines were announced, there were private parties trying to bring in Pfizer, trying to bring in Moderna, still continuing to try to do that, which they can't because of various obstinate responses by the government, like not giving immunity from liability, for example, which every other country has because it's an emergency measure. Which is why you and I today having this conversation in the middle of December in 2021, we can't get a booster shot even if we want one. We can't get a Pfizer booster shot to add to our Covishield or Covaxin even if we want one. And I think that one, the government needs to get out of the way of civil society, and two, it needs to provide the rule of law, which simply doesn't exist. And I think, on a lot of this, it might seem to people who might call you a communist and call me a libertarian that they might think that there are irreconcilable differences, but there really aren't. I think that there is so much common ground that, there is a lot to talk about. And a lot of that common ground comes from this experience we are going through over the last few years, when what was already a dysfunctional state has markedly become worse in some ways, more oppressive in some ways, which I find ironic because, there is this famous story of how during the emergency, George Fernandez, I think, was escaping the regime. They wanted to arrest him. He lands up in Ahmedabad station, and this RSS Pracharak in his 20s receives him and takes him to hideout, and that's Narendra Modi. So a lot of these guys, Modi, Jaitley, who was in jail during the emergency, they saw the horrors of the emergency, and the lessons you would have wanted them to learn is how bad the oppressive state is, and you would have imagined when they come to power, they will do something about it. But instead, the default reaction is now it is our turn, and which is also why I'm cynical about politics. It's easy when you're in the opposition to make virtuous noises, but the moment you get to power, you become the same demon that you were fighting.
I'll tell you where my question arises. One is, of course, the story you said about Modi. But the whole thing is that, Modi was from and is from the RSS. And the RSS, even when they had no power, believed in a fascist state. That was their belief. So, of course, the lessons, they opportunistically participated in the emergency. They were opportunistic during the freedom struggle. actually spelling it out, saying, pretend to participate, go to jail so that you can persuade people in jails that they're wasting their time fighting the British and they should be, gearing up to fight the Muslims and kill Muslims. So they, I think that's a different category altogether, and, different from the general cynicism you spoke about when it comes to politics. But my question about, for instance, public health, you gave the example of vaccines. But for me, the issue with public health in India is that for years, it's bothered me that basically it's been seen as a transaction between an individual and a service provider. So I need a health service, and can I pay for it? If I can't pay for it, then I should get insurance from my employer, and the employer will pay for it. The problem is that that is not the way public health crises work, especially epidemics. So I remember having a conversation with Rama Baru, who is a social health researcher and scholar. I had that conversation, an interview with her for the magazine I edit, Liberation, and we were talking about Japanese encephalitis epidemics. And she said, look, all the epidemics that we face in India, whether it's the yearly, dengue kind of epidemics, whether it is yearly encephalitis epidemics, whether it's the year-round TB and malaria issues, she said, you need a system that is able to prevent, predict, and basically serve everyone, because every individual is only as safe as the weakest individual in that society is. And you can't do that any other way except through a public health system. And a public health system has to then have the government really provide that service. And the poorest are most likely, whether it's health, whether it's education, the poorest are most likely to depend on what is publicly available, because they are not going to be able to afford it. And employers, relying on employers to provide these services is, employers in India systematically don't even pay the minimum wage. And I don't think that's only in India. They will defy paying even something that is legally mandated if they can get away with it. So what do you do? Surely COVID has brought home the fact that you need publicly funded public health systems to keep everyone safe. That's my argument. I certainly don't want the state interfering in everything, the state controlling every little thing. I would think that would lead to the kind of bureaucratic dystopias that you've seen in Soviet Russia at a certain time, or barring the initial few years, I would say, and China now and so on. Those are certainly not my ideal societies, no, not at all. But on the other hand, a society where, even in America, where people can go bankrupt trying to deal with a health issue because their employer won't cover health, that isn't, that cannot be an ideal society either, can it? So I'm just interested in knowing where, I know that would probably take a much longer conversation, but briefly, if you were to say, how do you address things which only a public health system can, effectively provide?
So I would briefly say that you might be surprised by this, but I agree with every word you said. There's no point of disagreement, but couple of ways I'd like to elaborate. One is that one of the things I have learned from talking with economists like Ajay Shah and Karthik Muralidharan on my show, I had great episodes with them where we discussed health, is that it's important to make the distinction between public health and healthcare. Like, to give an example, say, of mosquitoes and malaria, public health would make sure that there is enough fogging, defogging, whatever it is, to make sure that there are no mosquitoes, and healthcare would be to treat you for malaria if you do catch the disease. And by and large, public health has to be done by the state because it is like a public good, and healthcare should be done by the private sector. Both separate debates, and we can discuss the nuances of that at some other point. But in the context of COVID, I would say that the state should have actually done more. a lot of what had to be done was the responsibility of the state, because look, the fundamental purpose of the state is to protect its citizens. If for example one of our neighbors was to attack us, everybody would agree the state has to protect us. How is a virus like this, which is killing people the way it does, any less of an enemy?
No, I was just thinking in terms of, what you said about private health care. The thing is that I've just come from rural Bihar now, and it's not just COVID. I'm struck by the fact that essentially there is no public health care system at all. And health care is the care word is important there, because it means that as a society, and the state is supposed to reflect what the society feels. It's like we don't care for those who are just falling out of the system. So if somebody gets a minor, like a fever, any visit to the doctor, and inevitably it is a private healthcare provider, because the public healthcare system is missing in action in rural India largely, barring some states. The people are dependent. You immediately you have to borrow money, and you are in debt, and you have spent 5,000 to 10,000 rupees, like for a fever, for something like typhoid. And so how is somebody who is earning less than minimum wage even supposed to survive?
I absolutely agree with you. So one, I would say, is that where you have those kind of healthcare emergencies where the extremely poor are in that kind of situation, yes, it is a crisis and the state should step in. But if you look into why in the first place there is no healthcare, and why the healthcare situation is so dismal, if you look a little deeper, you will find that the hand of the state in different ways is behind it. For example, there is a Medical Council of India which acts as almost like a guild and mandates how many colleges there can be and how many people are coming out. Like, one way in which India is in fact failing is just there is a massive undersupply of doctors because of restrictions down the line. So if you peel back the layers, there is, the state is a problem there, and then there are other fundamental problems with healthcare. But it's not my case that the state should not have a role to play. My case is that the state should both do whatever it can do to alleviate immediate pain, and not, you can't just ignore that, but at the same time enable in every way that you can private enterprise to also fill gaps.
I totally agree. If it were a question of filling gaps, certainly private enterprise should do that. But I think the problem is, if the private sector is not just filling gaps, but actually largely if the health system is privatized. I was speaking to a doctor in Bihar, Dr. Shakil, and he was saying that India has one of the highest per patient out-of-pocket expenses. So something like diagnostics, which should be publicly provided, because it's simply unaffordable for somebody to get. And India, 70-80%, they are earning below minimum wage, and cannot afford to spend on a CT scan, an MRI, or even a simple other diagnostics like malaria diagnostics and so on. So the fact is that there's so much out-of-pocket expenditure that the poor person is then dependent on what we call jugaad, which is some kind of, you mentioned it in your episode on Ranbaxy and a scam, but I don't mean it in a scam sense. I mean it in the sense of having a network of somebody who can help you navigate the system and help you get things at a discount. But that is very cruel, because not everyone will have access to that.
My point is, here's the thing. In fields like healthcare and even education, what we have done is we've created a situation where you don't allow the private sector to function properly, and at the same time the state fails utterly, and then you say that, look, private bhi kuch nahi kar rahe, and it's a dismal state of affairs, and I agree with you. But if you go back to two sectors which are less crucial to us, both of us grew up in the 80s. You had to wait 8 years to get a telephone. It was a mess. The moment the government opens it up, you see what happens. Today I don't even know if MTNL exists, right? And every kid has a smartphone in his pocket. Similarly with airlines, I was a son of an IAS officer, incredibly privileged, but even I could not afford to fly in the 1980s, and you look what happened today. And the tragedy is that we haven't unleashed private enterprise in the areas which are most crucial. And my point is never, like, it's not an extreme either or. My point with both health and education is that let the government do what it is doing and we should hold it accountable and ask for more, but also allow civil society to solve its own problems. Markets are just one mechanism through which it happens. I worry that markets have gotten a bad name because a lot of what you see of markets in India are examples of cronyism and shady in different ways.
I just want to, and I think you would agree with me there that basically right now, the situation we're in now, where you have, it's like a education apartheid and a health apartheid,
Yeah.
where huge swaths of society are basically barred from access. And, I have just come from a place where there's this remarkable movement that, as you said, people stepping in. People have begun a movement demanding that the government schools function.
Yeah.
So it's a sadak per school, they're holding schools on the street. These are not just mock performances. They're actually holding classes on the street to show that, to demonstrate that there are people willing to teach, students willing to learn. Okay, classes are happening, the bell is ringing every hour and classes are happening, and then they're inviting district administration to come and local political leadership to come. One of the people from my party, a young man from my party, won the elections there on the strength of this movement. And they are saying, look, if the school can function on the street, it's looking for a home. Why are government schools being shut down? And part of the reason why, there are thousands of government schools in India which are being starved of resources and then shut down. And there is a massive privatization of education, and privatization without any kind of quality regulation and all of that. And people in India want desperately to educate their children, right? Yeah, so they really want, and what they are wanting, and these are especially people, by the way, from mostly from oppressed castes as well. And so they want a place where, they can be assured, they can hold government accountable, and that's why they want the government schools to function.
So what I would say is that this is one great way in which civil society is demonstrating something and making a strong point and all of that. But another way is through budget private schools, like different studies, and James Tooley has a great book on this called The Invisible Tree or something like that. And different studies have shown that budget private schools across the country, even when not legal, functioning underground in slums, have done really well in the sense that poor people, auto drivers and domestic servants, have preferred to spend a large chunk of their salary sending their kid to a budget private school, which they can afford, rather than to a free government school. And my point is not that you should privatize education, which also isn't happening either. My point is that let's do both. Let's have the kind of agitations that you have had to make government schools come up to speed, but allow parents a choice, allow private schools to function in a way that is not jugaru, that is not against the law. It's a traffic signal is also, such an interesting place, because when I talk about the seen and the unseen, I talk about how so many of us in our privilege, and certainly I have to keep snapping myself out of this, that whatever happens outside our car, is invisible to us. It's like these people don't exist. We don't notice it.
Yeah, and that's it, to me, basically transgender people in the city, right?
Yeah.
They occupy the space that is strangely visible and invisible. Where my office is in Lakshmi Nagar, there is a large community of transgender people very close by. A lot of them would be doing both begging as well as sex work. And the point is that in a way everyone knows that community is there and they are out here amongst us. And at the same time there is a sense that they are supposed to be invisible and they shouldn't be, you're not supposed to acknowledge that they exist, So in your ordinary, if you're holding a celebration, festival celebration in your mohalla, then in your locality, then you wouldn't invite these people, So that kind of apartheid of various kinds exists so much in India. And these are sort of public secrets, which, public secret is a lovely phrase which my friend Pratiksha Bakshi used, in terms of the law when she's written this book about the rape law. But I think it applies in so many ways because these are things everyone knows, but you're not supposed to acknowledge. And India's especially, I think Indian society is especially good at doing this. So,
So I want to ask you a
yeah.
question about another unseen aspect of India, and of course I loved reading your book Fearless Freedom, which by the way everyone should read, man or woman. And and one of the things which many people don't realize, and I as a man also did not realize for a long time, is that women in India live a different life compared to the men completely. It is a different world. Like, as a man, I can go out for a walk late at night without thinking twice. I can get into a crowded lift without seeing who the other people are. And women carry this extra layer of awareness around them, which seems tragic to me. But even beyond that, the truth is, India is no country for women. And it's good that that siren is blaring, because this is an emergency that has been there for 70 years. That half our population is almost, we are treated as second class citizens, disempowered in so many different ways. And we are driving towards Shaheen Bagh right now. And part of what was inspiring, among so many other things about Shaheen Bagh, was that women went there to protest and to fight and all of that. So I I have really two questions. One is that, do you see this awareness even among women of that desire to fight back? Do you see a little more of it? And also, why is it that so many women don't see this also as a political issue? Like, when if you support the current regime, for example, or
Yeah. Well, I think it's a question of how you put two and two together, and that's what, like, people's consciousness are rather fragmented often, all of us, right? We are very many different people in our heads, and we tell stories to explain our reality to ourselves, and those stories are often contradictory, right? So that is why you have वो क्या बंद हो गया?
हॉट हो गया ओवरहीटिंग. बाकी तो चल रहा है.
बाकी चल रहा है.
If you look at this little tapuri where they are able to sell, cigarettes and whatever, something like a shop like this, what has happened is that it has increasingly, especially since demonetization and the way in which employment has been hit, we are now, I think, we have levels of unemployment which we had 45 years ago. And what has happened is that these become disguised unemployment then.
Yeah.
So you had Modi say that, there's employment because people are selling pakoras on the street, so these are little food stalls. But actually, it's become harder to run those food stalls, and not only because of COVID. Even before that, the city as it is structured is very cruel to street vendors. It is cruel to the homeless. You have parks. People could sleep in parks. Now you're just, shutting them off and not letting people have, basic ways of surviving. So it's become cruel, and so very often these shops and all represent not employment but disguised unemployment.
Exactly, or underemployment.
Underemployment,
And in
otherwise
fact, the
also,
great unmeasured tragedy, I think, in India over the last few years is that this part of the economy, the informal sector, has been completely ignored, because this doesn't show up in GDP, right? You measure the formal sector and you have proxies and you make assumptions about how the informal sector is doing.
Yeah.
And my belief is that demonetization hit the informal sector disproportionately hard, and COVID has hit the informal sector disproportionately hard, and there's no acknowledgement of this. And because we are in this age of narrative building, it's like, oh, look how well the stock markets are doing, which are entirely because of different factors: easy money, liquidity from outside, and so on and so forth. And this part of the there isn't consolidated data on what's happening here. There's anecdotal evidence from anyone who travels, such as people like yourself. But you need to find ways of making that more visible to people and
That's
put it
true.
out there
And,
in the discourse.
It's really very, very hard. Very, very hard on people. Good. So, I think women in India, their sense of continuously being watched. I remember that when I first read John Berger's Ways of Seeing, and he says this about women continuously, and he says it, of course, about women in Europe and all of that, continuously surveilling themselves as a protection mechanism, because by surveilling themselves, they are somewhat able to control how society perceives them. I think that's so true in India, and I just sort of thrilled to it when I read those lines, because in public spaces in India, in private spaces in India, women are continuously being watched and judged for their conduct, And this is a form of violence that's not just sexual violence. But why isn't there more protest about it? Well, I think, in fact, the remarkable thing is that you have started having much more protest against this since 2012-13. For me, everyone remembers that 2012 movement as the anti-rape movement in Delhi. But for me, it certainly wasn't the first movement against sexual violence in India. But it was, for me, the first moment when you had widespread public expression of protest by women, especially young women, against the surveillance and the restrictions in the name of safety. So after that, you've had this Pinjra Tod movement, and you've had so many people, like young women students in places, far-flung places. You've had women protesting hostel restrictions there. So I think there is more protest now, but it's up against a lot worse now, because you're not up against just apathy anymore. You're not just up against the anxieties of your parents, which you could resolve with time and with conversations. You're up against an organized political force that is out there to attack women's autonomy. So just to give you an example, parents in India have always been uneasy with their daughters falling in love and breaking the caste system or out of the community. So a Hindu woman marrying a Muslim man, parents of the woman are never comfortable. But what is happening now is, earlier you would have a situation where, okay, they'll fall in love, they'll run away, get married, and eventually maybe the parents will come around by the time the first child is born and they want to bond with the grandchild. So they'll grumble a bit, but they'll get used to it. But now what you're having is that you have these far-right, Hindu supremacist outfits arriving at the door, so being, they're like service providers. They're there to offer you, they'll say, we'll get your daughter back, we'll break that marriage up, we'll get her married again, so you don't have to worry about any of that. If she's pregnant, we'll get a forced abortion done. And we'll change her mind. We'll do all that coercion for you. You don't have to do anything except just allow us to, use you as a front and say that our daughter has been kidnapped, abducted, whatever. So I think this is a terrible situation, because then the pressure on young women in these situations is awful, because they have to, keep themselves strong in the face of so many levels of coercive pressure. It's very, very, very hard, very difficult. And as you said, what happened in Shaheen Bagh, I think broke so many stereotypes and empowered so many women, because you had Muslim women leading from the front. So, for me, one of the most remarkable things was that you had so many women in the Shaheen Bagh movement who were elderly Muslim women. And I saw them in close interaction with, everyone who was thronging to Shaheen Bagh to be part of those protests. And, they were watching young Delhi women who were modern, dressing in a way in which these elderly women may not have been entirely comfortable, okay? But somehow they never made that an issue. And they were welcoming, they would be so interested in talking to, listening to women from different strands of society. And I think that was, to me, what was so special about Shaheen Bagh, that it once again, in our fragmented society where realities are fragmented, everyone is in their own silos, and there's so much organized, hateful propaganda. Shaheen Bagh opened up these spaces where you could actually go and listen, and not just to people who are speaking from the dais, but just listen to other people, meet people from so many different backgrounds, and just learn. And if I could run the country, then I would say that I would try to find a way in which you could have a local Shaheen Bagh of sorts as a regular phenomenon, not just as a protest site, but as a site where you basically talk about the constitutional values, constitutional morality, and social morality. So that distinction that Ambedkar made between the fact that social morality may be very, very unjust, but that we should learn to uphold constitutional morality, which is that even if internally I don't agree with young women dressing in clothing I consider inappropriate, but constitutional morality means that I respect their right to do so, and I try not to look at them only through that lens. I try to see what they are, what they believe in, and what they are speaking about beyond that. So I would want, education about constitutional morality to happen not as a state sponsored, bits of propaganda, but as places where these discussions can happen.
Ambedkar also used the phrase for the constitution that it is only a topsoil, because he recognized that society is deeply liberal, and on this one instance I kind of agree with Gandhi's argument that you have to change society from the bottom up. You cannot impose a change from the top down. And I think that's a mistake we made and a failure we made. And Shaheen Bagh did give, also give me a hope, and not just Shaheen Bagh, but all the other protests across the country, that perhaps in certain ways, certain parts of the culture are changing. My other question is, when I think about, for example, when I think about the unseen ways in which the world is different from men and women, because I think that all the different ways in which the patriarchy has kind of designed a world which is for men, and women have to adjust, is sort of unseen.
Oh, I definitely think so, and I think that there are more. There is, for instance, if you look at the debate around the menstruation leave and all of that, which you are now having a lot more of. And I, of course, also point out that, in Bihar, women asked for menstruation leave and got it in Lalu Yadav's first chief ministership. And it happened because union leaders were having a meeting with Laluji, and they mentioned this because women had been demanding this, women government employees. And he promptly agreed. That issue breaks stereotypes about Bihari women. It also breaks stereotypes about Lalu Yadav. Okay, that he apparently lost no time in saying, yes, that's a very reasonable request, and that's a very reasonable demand, and agreed. And it's been going on since then. The thing is that I loved what you said about how the world is designed, and we know now that it includes medical science about race, medical science about gender. So much of what we see as science has also got this implicit bias that increasingly now is beginning to be recognized. But when it comes to the fact that the world is designed for a worker who doesn't menstruate, so what about people who do menstruate? That becomes seen as a special concession. But that's because you're assuming that the body of the average worker is designed a certain way, and you shouldn't be doing that. Once it was assumed that workers should not sleep. Workers have had to fight for demanding time to sleep, time to eat, because those are seen as basic functions of the human body, right? And even today, of course, now they're having to fight those struggles all over again, because you're not even being given time to pee in so many of the workspaces in India, for instance. But when it comes to being a woman, I think that keeping on, having to go on reminding the world around you that you are designed differently, and not just in terms of physical difference, but the fact is that the world should acknowledge that you exist and should budget for your being there. In public spaces in Delhi, for instance, I remember that when I was a student in Delhi in the 90s, there was literally so few places that you could find a public toilet, and in Bombay in the early 90s. So we would be experts at I'm still an expert at knowing where are the places where you can either sneak in and use the loo, or you can walk up and demand to use the loo and you're likely to get it. So if you're in rural India, usually there's a State Bank of India outlet here and there, and they will be quite happy to allow you to use the loo. So I know that. But I notice men don't. And now now you have, of course, the petrol pumps, right? So, but men don't need to do that. They have never needed to think about that in India, because the street is your loo. You don't need it. It's like that. But I think it is changing.
Do you think our politics would be different if there were more assertive, empowered women in it? Like even the few women that we have often been part of a political family, and that's why they're there. And and there are issues with those individuals also a lot of the time. But if there were more women in our politics, do you feel at some level it would be different? And do you feel that at some level it would even be possible? I mean, given the party in charge, for example.
No doubt it would be different, but I think what to me the question is, what is going to allow more women to be themselves in politics, because the point is that when you are in politics, and electoral politics in particular, there are all kinds of compulsions the world over. And so one thing which I think would make a difference would be if we were to have a system of proportional representation rather than just first past the post. Immediately you would have a larger space for smaller groups which are more courageous when it comes to breaking social norms. It is what it is, because bigger parties, pan-Indian parties, they all tend to be much more conservative, and therefore even when they field a woman, they expect that woman to behave in a certain way when she conducts herself in public life. And the willingness to break those rules and to believe that you can survive breaking those rules, I think a proportional representation system would automatically allow smaller groups to function.
I'd had this conversation with Jayaprakash Nara, and he told me that he championed an amendment which almost got through circa 2005,
Okay.
and the only reason it didn't get through, all the parties agreed on it, but the only reason it didn't get through was because Sonia Gandhi was against it, because she assumed that the Congress is such a dominant force, it will hurt us if there is proportional representation. And you see the irony of that today.
Exactly.
That
Exactly.
it's
Exactly. I mean, I think India would be a much better place if there was a lot more space for smaller parties to have representation. If you have a substantial support base, you should have representation in decision making.
look outside, garbage dump and cows.
Swachh Bharat.
Yeah, there is your Swachh Bharat. There is what you consider holy, and at the same time, what the reality of our country is also is all in
The
one
cow
frame.
will be surviving on eating
Yeah.
plastic and dying as a result.
Ouch! Yeah,
Terrible, terrible.
it's very sad.
And that's the thing, that's another public secret. So if you ask, very often people want to repeat what they hear on TV. So they'll say, oh, India's cleaner. It's demonstrably not, It is the exact same as it used to be. You still have all this, it has not changed because there have been no attempts to put in place any better system of sanitation and dealing with garbage and all of that, right? So, of course it's not, but the point is you're supposed to say that it is better.
And to point it out is actually a sign of our love for the country. We want it not to be dirty. That's why we point it out.
Exactly.
And those who choose to elide the question, they are the true anti-nationals.
Yeah. I mean, you want less pollution on the streets so that everyone can breathe better, right?
Yeah.
But it's considered a heresy to say that we have reached the Shaheen Bagh area, and I look out here and I see these shops which are run by Muslims, and there's a visibility of Muslims on the street. And I'm reminded that before last year's movement, I was once returning in an auto from Lakshmi Nagar, that's East Delhi, to South Delhi, where I live. And it was Eid. And so there were families, Muslim families, out in public celebrating near that Central Vista area that we crossed. So that was the boat club area, the India Gate area. So they were out there eating ice creams and whatever. And there was a small traffic, like a little bit of a traffic jam, because there were a few more cars out on the street. And this driver, he said, oh, look at them, there are so many of them. There are too many of them. And it's because of that you have this jam. And I said, oh, but you have far worse traffic jams in Bombay, for instance, when there's Ganpati, or when there is the Hindu festivals for Ganesh or Krishna and all of that, and in Delhi. So I named several other occasions in which other religious festivals had created. So he said, no, those jams, wo chaltao jams, those traffic jams tend to be, they move faster, but this one is much more. It made no sense rationally, but the point is that he was justifying his prejudice that came out at the sight of Muslims being themselves, enjoying themselves in public space. And you think about a place like Shaheen Bagh, where in a way there's a ghettoization. So Muslims they live in these areas. They are often denied accommodation in other parts of our cities. But in this place, they can be themselves, or at least that was the case until recently. So, you can see them enjoying themselves, being themselves, without that sense of being watched, surveilled. It used to be the case, a little less probably than elsewhere. But probably that's changed now, I don't know.
Speaking of being themselves, do you find that sometimes you think twice before being yourself? Would the persona that you then have to put out in both your activism or in your politics or on social media, does that also then need to be shaped by strategy? Is that something that you consciously think about, one? And two, do you think that more people, including dissenters today, have to also think in strategic terms, where it is not just about their message of dissent, but also how do we, more garbage dumps outside, but also how do we actually make our message resonate more with others?
I do think so. I think that being strategic is important. Being strategic doesn't mean being dishonest. And that doesn't mean that I'm tailoring a persona out. My point is that we are using personas all the time, right? Even, in our private conversations and all of that, we choose different postures and different tones that we adopt. So I feel that a combative tone isn't always the best way. And sometimes I have to check myself often about that, because I do tend to be polemical and combative. I know I'm good at polemics and I like being argumentative. But I feel as though sometimes being more open, more persuasive, not being combative means that you're communicating with far more people. You have to try and figure out how to get people to see, how to shift perspective, and you have to be willing to shift your own perspective. If you aren't doing that, there is no way you can have social change, And so I feel very frustrated sometimes by the ways in which social media creates these boundaries. What is more challenging is when you're trying to engage with someone who is a victim of one kind of oppression, but who is having difficulty empathizing with someone of a different oppression. So, simply spoken, if you have women feeling, and very rightly so, profiled for the way they dress and act and so on, but if a young woman student is not able to imagine how a young Muslim man may feel profiled for the way he dresses or his beard or his cap or whatever it is, then that's a problem. So you have to try and create those spaces for more empathy and solidarity. And I feel you can't do that if you're always trying to speak in a way where you can never make a mistake. The whole thing is that, people will make mistakes. Even us, you will not always express yourself in the best possible way. So if I say something about the reaction of the BJP to the massacre by the army in Nagaland is different from what it would be had the same thing happened in Kashmir. Suddenly there are, so-called woke people saying, no, how dare you make a comparison? You're comparing pain. And I said, no, I'm not. I am comparing how Kashmiris are not allowed to do what the Naga people are able to do right now, and that doesn't mean the Naga people have suffered less. It simply means that the calculations of those in power, especially the BJP, are different. They see the Northeast and Nagaland as a constituency which they would want to cultivate. They see Kashmir as real estate and as politically useful real estate. So the punishment of the Kashmiri is something that is they can cash it in for votes in the rest of India. But that's not the case when it comes to Nagaland, and how can you not recognize that, even if you are from the Northeast, So I think those conversations, a lot more of those have to happen. But here we are, this road last year was one of the roads on which the Jamia students had been protesting. I'm pretty sure this was the road. And I remember that, there was beautiful postering and graffiti all over, which has been removed. It was amazing, who said, I don't remember who said that the walls are the publishers of the poor.
Wow, that's a beautiful
well, I read it in a book by Eduardo Galeano, but I don't remember who he was quoting. But it said, maybe he was just quoting a bit of graffiti, and the walls here in this area were full of such wonderful art that was speaking, about the kind of India which we would want to create and which we would want to celebrate. And all of it has been, very violently removed now. And so many of those who were creators of that art are in prison. And there's a whole atmosphere of fear here.
But just riffing off that, I would say that while it was true that once walls were the publisher of the poor, today the internet also is. The means of production are now in the hands of everyone. And I often say, in fact, that where politics has failed, where social movements has failed, technology might succeed by empowering individuals. And if there's one thing that gives me hope, it is that, even through all of the dissent that has been happening because of CAA or whatever, people can coordinate, people can understand each other, people can fight dangerous false narratives through technology. And I find, if there's one thing I'm hopeful about, it really is that.
I used to think so, and I really, when I knew far less about the internet, I'm afraid. I still know very little, that's true. And I think that, yes, there are pockets of very, ways in which the internet can be very democratic, where it has been used to organize and all of that. But, lately I get very, with the takeover of so many, with the internet also becoming real estate, and the takeover of vast swaths of it by huge corporations and so I feel as though it's become a place where very dangerous far-right forces also think of it as a way to control narratives, control minds, and mobilize and all of that. And it isn't an equal playing field at all. They have much, much more power to do it than say the good guys do. Don't you think? I mean,
I'll no, you're right, but I'll think aloud and I'll propose a counterpoint, which is that on the one hand, you have the collective effort of these far right movements or these political movements with tons of money, and they can manipulate narratives and all of that. But and on the other hand, you have a dispersed group of individuals who can express themselves in disparate ways. And in the short term, it seems that of course a dispersed group of individuals doesn't stand a chance. But I think in the long term, the fact that there are a dispersed group of individuals who can express themselves and reach out to others can also be an advantage. And I'm kind of thinking aloud here because,
well,
politics changes,
dispersed
incentives
group, I
change.
agree. But I just stopped you because we could hear the sound of the
The azan.
azan. So the muezzin's call, and well, I was just thinking, some time back you were talking about Lal Bahadur Shastri saying, as a Prime Minister, I won't display my religion.
Absolutely.
And, a couple of days ago, a friend was telling me that, look, isn't it ironic that you have the Prime Minister,
Shocking.
on national television being able to, perform his religion and, inaugurate religious sites and so on, while the Muslims are not being allowed to pray in public in Gurgaon, not far from Delhi, not at all far from Delhi. And even in Delhi, I know that for several years now, there have been issues. Even prior to BJP's coming to power, it had started. So if BJP was in power in Delhi, but not in the country, even then it had started. So I know that, public praying spaces have the continuous attempt to shrink those, to not allow the loudspeaker to be used for these calls and all of that. And I find that so disturbing because, I feel as though there's a sense in which people don't, Hindus don't really realize the kind of privilege they have. And I find that even among the well-meaning people, there's this assumption that the country belongs to Hindus. Hindus chose to make it secular, democratic, whatever. So others are basically very magnanimously being given space here. And I feel as though it's not, people think it is a wokeness and, just performative wokeness when you call this out. But I feel as though I have to keep reminding myself. And I remember I started doing this in the early 90s when I had not been exposed to any politics too much. I was not part of any political formation. But I remember my sister and I having a conversation in which we realized that we were talking as though the country was ours.
Yeah.
And when we were saying we and they, and then suddenly we realized this and we said, look, this is exactly what's wrong. Where can the Muslim talk in the same way about the country as though, it belongs to them and we are kind of, deciding the rules of who lives how.
And sometimes I think you need to zoom out a little bit. Like, two of the books I really liked over the last 3 years, which I think everyone should read, is Tony Joseph's Early Indians and
Yes.
Peggy Mohan's Wanderers, Kings, Merchants. And what they both show, Tony through the study of genetics and Peggy through the study of languages, is that we are basically this insane khichdi. And, there is not a word a Hindu can use which doesn't have an influence from somewhere. In every sentence there'll be a word which comes from somewhere else. In every meal, most of the constituents of every meal we eat would have come from somewhere or the other. And Tony's wonderful book also has this really interesting point where he quotes David Reich that India is actually not one large population. India is a collection of many small populations. What do you think about this, especially in the context of the fact that very soon the road will be passing, will take us through something that's been at the forefront of protests of people arguing for exactly this, for a broader vision of this great country?
I think you're absolutely right that, see, the attempt right now in India, the dangerous thing that the Citizenship Amendment Act did is to try and narrow the idea of citizenship to something that excludes Muslims, but it doesn't only exclude Muslims. The worst part is that when the state assumes the power to to make a list of who is a citizen and who is not, then what I would in those days talk to Hindus about was that then if you allow the state to have this power, then the state will not allow even the Hindus to have any political autonomy whatsoever. Because the minute they see you as anything less than a captive support base, the minute you display autonomy, they have the power to disenfranchise you, to say this is a doubtful citizen. And that is what those laws are about. And what I also feel a great deal of concern about is the fact that the ways in which these dangerous ideologies enter and gain power is sometimes not through the obvious route. So the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, which I keep telling people that even
You're
a child,
Jamia.
the Jamia campus last year, which was attacked so brutally by the police.
A nice sunny winter morning today.
Yes, and I remember how terrible it was to. I was in Tamil Nadu traveling last time on a train, and I got a call from students hiding from police bullets inside here, saying we can hear bullet shots, do something. And I remember feeling so helpless from far away. What could we do? So I feel as though the thing is that the National Register of Citizens, which I say any child who's read Harry Potter can understand, it's like the Muggle register, the Muggle born register, okay? The idea that you have to prove your citizenship to the state, that surely should be something that is, has to be taboo in all over the world. And I still feel as though the complete horror of that is yet to be realized even by people in India and in Assam, in the Northeast, in South Asia more generally, all of this. And I feel as though the horror of it was realized so sharply by people who stood to lose the most. So yes, I mean, Muslims did understand that, because the government was openly saying we will exclude Muslims. So you had the Home Minister quite openly saying that the CA was there to separate Muslims from the rest. But I remember one thing which is hopeful. Jamia was attacked on 15 December and I was in Tamil Nadu then. I was flying back from Tamil Nadu on 19 December. And when we were about to land in Delhi, the woman on the seat next to me asked me very tentatively, do you think roads will be open? Because I hear there's a big protest in Delhi today. So I thought, she's concerned about, traffic jams or whatever. So I told her, look, near the airport, no, where do you need to go? She said, oh, I'm not asking because of that. And then she burst forth, sort of. She said, I'm asking because I would like to be part of it, and I feel so guilty that, we all have our problems, and I trusted the media to tell me the truth. I trusted that the news would tell me if something was deeply wrong, and I didn't even know that this law had been passed. And it was only when I saw Jamia students in the Delhi winter, freezing Delhi winter, stripped of their clothing, being beaten by police on TV. When I saw that on TV, I said, what have I been doing? And so when she said that, the woman on the seat behind us very tentatively asked, I'd like to know more about the CA. Do you know? Can you tell me what it is? And these were all Hindu women. And I explained briefly what it was. I said, this is it. And in explaining, I said, look, it will not affect only Muslims. It will, of course, it's meant to be Islamophobic, but among its other purposes is to control the entire population, no matter who. And this woman stopped me and she said, no, don't say that. It doesn't matter. I don't want to hear that it might affect me as well. I should care even if it only affects Muslims. And I feel so, she again repeated that I feel so guilty that I didn't look beyond what the, TV news was telling me, primetime news was telling me. And I didn't know that this was happening. So I think that was, what they did at Jamia backfired on them quite a bit. And that gives me hope. because they didn't realize that the same night students would come out, young people would come out all over India to occupy public spaces and protest what was happening to Jamia. They thought they could isolate and stigmatize Jamia students. And I believe it can happen again. I believe the farmers' movement was another such moment. And every time the government thinks they've gotten one moment under control, it's going to break out somewhere else.